Wealth is not armor. Have you ever thought this? That when a woman lives behind a meter-high iron gate with bodyguards, a security system, a private lawyer, she is safe? I used to think so too, until I learned about Priscilla Davis. Because money only creates the illusion of protection. It can't protect you from the man you sleep with, the man who knows all, the codes, the man who has the keys, and most importantly, the man who starts calculating that killing his wife is cheaper than divorce. This is not an ordinary case. This is the story of the richest man ever tried for murder in American history, and the woman who survived the gunshot but never survived justice. The poorest girl stepping into the richest world, Priscilla Davis, wasn't born into luxury. She was born Priscilla Lee Childers in a small town called Dublin, Texas. Her childhood was filled with poverty, a father who disappeared from her life, leaving behind only a few old photographs. She once said something heartbreaking. My father forgot to do two things. One was to come home. Two was to send money. Priscilla's mother was the sole breadwinner, a woman who once dreamed of a better life, but married twice and was abandoned twice. The whole family lived in cramped conditions, relying on a single uncle and having to count every penny. Priscilla remembers that poverty very clearly. I had exactly 25 cents. I had to choose either a sandwich or cigarettes. In the end, I stole my mother's cigarettes. I smoked so well that my mother even switched to the same brand as me. That was the childhood of a girl who had never been protected. Tragedy came very early. At 15, Priscilla was sexually assaulted by a boy. She trusted a belated apology through the train window as he left to join army, a wound that never healed. At 16, she had a child, no husband. She hastily married Jasper Baker, a former Marine, only to discover he was having an affair with a 4-year-old woman whom Priscilla, then 16, called an old hag. Abandoned again. She took her young daughter to California in search of hope, then returned to Texas in despair, her belongings piled in the back of her pickup truck, a Steinbeck out of sync with the times, a ticket to escape poverty, or a golden cage. After 2 jobs, 10 months of struggling, Priscilla married Jack. Wilborn, a used car salesman in Houston. Life began to improve. They entered Fort Worth's social circle, but in 1961, Priscilla was arrested for shoplifting. A dress, a sweater, another dress. She pleaded guilty, paid a $50 fine, and then she met T. Cullen Davis, a man who wasn't just rich, but super rich, a Texas oil tycoon with an estimated net worth of $100 to $500 million. The two met at the Ridglia Country Club, playing doubles tennis. Priscilla and her husband beat Cullen and his wife. Not long after, both couples separated. And from New York, at the company's Christmas party at the Waldorf Astoria, Cullen called to propose. Priscilla was stunned, but agreed. From a girl who used to steal her mother's cigarettes, she was about to become the mistress of a multi-million-dollar mansion, a luxurious marriage, and the price of belonging to a man. If you think that from the moment Priscilla entered her marriage with Cullen Davis, all the suffering ended, then know the real tragedy had only just begun. They married on the 29th of August, 1968, a very frightening detail that few people noticed. That was also the day Cullen Davis's father died. That morning, relatives came to offer their condolences. That afternoon, Cullen introduced Priscilla, this is my wife. The faces were expressionless. From the very first day, this marriage had a strange atmosphere, a mixture of mourning and ostentation. A close friend of theirs once said something that still sends chills down my spine today. She's a show-off, and he's a peeping Tom. They were born to destroy each other. And indeed, Priscilla quickly became the perfect exhibit. Cullen used money to rebuild his wife, breast augmentation surgery. Bold outfits, appearances at every major social event in Fort Worth. At the Colonial Golf Tournament, men lined both sides of the fairway just to watch Priscilla standing at the 9th or 18th hole in a short skirt, a low-cut neckline, and once she even had a cast on her leg. But the rest was almost completely exposed. Priscilla knew what people were saying about her, and she didn't deny it. She once laughed and said that she had shaved her pubic hair into a heart shape. Cullen liked that. He often walked a few steps behind Priscilla, not out of gallantry, but to watch the other men looking at his possession. One observer made a truly haunting remark. He treats her like a 1,908 Ford. Everyone wants to own her, but only he has the money to maintain. That, it sounds poetic, but in reality, it was absolute possession. And when a man treats his wife as property, then violence is only a matter of time. Dream Palace, a marble-decorated prison. In 1972, Cullen Davis began building what he called Priscilla's dream home, 180 acres, adjacent to the Colonial Country Club golf course. The house was named Stonegate. Cost $6 million in the 1,970 seconds equivalent to approximately $45 million today. Construction took 3.5 years. 5 bedrooms, 11 bathrooms, over 17,000 square feet, an indoor swimming pool, glass walls surrounding it. Priscilla's bathroom was larger than many people's bedrooms. Hot pink mirrors, crystal chandeliers, a built-in marble bathtub where she could look down on her entire kingdom. But you know what? This house wasn't just built for enjoyment. It was built for control. A closed courtyard, tunnels connecting the areas, surveillance cameras, a sophisticated security system with 2 control panels that Cullen himself oversaw every detail. According to Priscilla's later testimony during the marriage, she was beaten constantly. Her nose was broken twice. Her collarbone was broken once. Her eldest daughter also had a broken nose. Once, Cullen used Priscilla's crutches to beat her while she was recovering from a skiing accident. In a fit of rage, he threw the family cat to the floor to death. And then on Priscilla's birthday in 1974, she discovered her jewelry was missing. She confronted him. She screamed, "You want a divorce? Fine, you'll have it." Cullen replied coldly, "It's all right. I've been divorced before." Priscilla responded, "No, Cullen, not this way. You've never been through this." And that was true. He had never, but he was about to be, and he wouldn't accept it. The next part is when money, hatred, and a court ruling drive a man to a decision that he believes will solve everything. Afternoon verdict, a nighttime massacre. Please remember this date. Afternoon of the 2nd of August, 1976. Judge Joe Eidson ruled to increase Priscilla's provisional alimony from $3,500 per month to $5,000 per month. And that's not all. Cullen Davis was also ordered to pay $25,000 in attorney fees, $24,000 in household expenses. At that point, the divorce had been going on for 2 years, and Priscilla was seeking a settlement of nearly $50 million. Cullen was barred from entering Stonegate by security order. Money was flowing like blood. Lawyers, the court. A woman he hated was taking his assets piece by piece. If you were in the mind of an absolute controller, a man who never accepts defeat, then that afternoon's verdict was not a legal decision. It was a trigger. That night, Stonegate was almost empty. The staff had gone home. Stan Farr hadn't arrived. Priscilla was out for dinner. Only Andrea Wilborn, Priscilla's 2-year-old daughter, had just returned from Bible summer camp, a quiet child who loved to read, alone in the 17,000 square foot house. No one knew that in that very house, a man who knew every entrance, every camera, every code was coming in. Around 12:30 a.m., Priscilla and Stan Farr returned. The door wasn't locked. The security system was off. The basement door was wide open. Then Priscilla saw blood, handprints, drag marks, dark red stains on the pressix, kitchen wall. She screamed for Stan, and from the shadows, a man emerged, dressed entirely in black, wearing a woman's wig askew, his hands wrapped in black plastic garbage bags. Terrifyingly calm, he looked at Priscilla and said, "Hello." Then he fired. The bullet pierced Priscilla's chest, passing through her body, missing. Death by only a few centimeters. Stan Farr heard the scream and ran down the stairs. According to Priscilla, 2 men wrestled through the doorway. Gunshots rang out through the wood. Stan was shot. He opened the door. He tried to grab the attacker, but Cullen Davis pulled away and fired again. 4 shots. Stan Farr collapsed to the floor. Priscilla looked into his eyes. She said, "I looked into his eyes. I watched him die." In the basement electrical room, the police found Andrea, shot once in the chest. At close range, the bullet nearly severed her carotid artery. She died alone on the cold concrete floor. And from that moment, the man who had just left that house became the richest defendant ever to stand trial for murder in U.S. history. But don't think that such an obvious truth will lead to justice, because the real battle hasn't begun yet. In the next part, I will take you into the trial, where the victim is judged instead of the murderer. And believe me, what happened in the courtroom was even more brutal than the night of the massacre, the trial, when the survivor becomes the defendant. If you think that, after a night with 3 living witnesses, after a 2-year-old child dies in the basement, after an adult man is shot dead, right outside the door, justice will come quickly. No. In Texas, in 1977, justice still had to see who had enough money to buy a better story. The case was moved from Fort Worth to Amarillo, more than 500 kilometers away, a conservative area, less sympathetic to women dressed provocatively, less sympathetic to ostentatious high society. And most importantly, it was where Cullen's lawyer wanted to try the case. That man's name was Richard Racehorse Haynes, a legend in Texas criminal law, wearing ostrich leather boots, smoking a pipe incessantly. And he won 163 consecutive DUI cases. His philosophy was simple and terrifying. No need for the truth, just sow enough doubt. 3 witnesses said the shooter was Cullen Davis, Priscilla, who was shot through the chest, Gus Gavril Jr., who was shot in the spine, permanently paralyzed, Beverly Bass, the 6-year-old who escaped in, quote, panic. Motives were there, opportunities were there, knowledge of the security system was there. But Haynes didn't attack the evidence. He attacked Priscilla. Week after week, Priscilla wasn't asked about her dead daughter. She was questioned about men in her life, clothes she wore, sexual positions, sex toys found in her home, Percodan painkillers, parties, extramarital affairs. 1. She was forced to describe her sexual fantasies before a conservative jury. A diamond necklace, a gift from Cullen himself with the inscription, "Rich," was presented as evidence of moral depravity, not to prove the defendant's crime, but to prove that a woman like this is not trustworthy. Haynes planted a single thought in the minds of the 12 jurors. If Priscilla lied about morality, she could also lie about the murder of her child. November 1922. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury declared not guilty. A juror told the press, "We can't believe a man like him would do," something like that. Priscilla collapsed in court. A few days later, Cullen Davis was seen playing billiards at the Petroleum Club, as if no child had ever died in his basement. But the story doesn't end there, because when the law fails to kill the enemy, there are those with enough money to find other ways. In the next part, I will tell you about the conspiracy behind the conspiracy, acquisition, the recording, and when good doesn't mean good. And there, you will see how far a man went to never have to pay price after acquittation when good doesn't mean good. Do you think that after being acquitted, Cullen Davis would stop? No, because there are men who never feel safe just because they got away with it. 4 months after the trial, Cullen Davis was arrested again. This time, not for what happened at Stonegate, but for what he was allegedly planning to do next. The FBI launched a sting operation. A man named David McCrory played the role of a hired assassin wearing a hidden microphone, meeting Cullen Davis in the parking lot of a Coco's hamburger restaurant near Fort Worth. McCrory said something that still chills to hear today. "I killed the no judge for you." Cullen Davis replied, "Good." Just one word, short, emotionless. If you were a normal person, you would think, that's it, a tape recording, an indirect confession. But no, Richard Racehorse Haynes returned. And this time, he brought with him a linguistics professor from Georgetown University. This man stood before the court and said, the word good doesn't necessarily mean good. Maybe it was just a communicative reflex. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the conversation was about sunglasses. Sounds absurd, doesn't it? The first jury deliberated for 44 hours and then reached a stalemate. The second trial ended with an acquittal. All charges related to the Stonegate massacre were completely dropped. Cullen Davis walked out of court once again, free. And Priscilla understood one thing. He would never go to prison. But there was another path. The path Priscilla still hoped for. Civil. Now I will take you into the civil trial. When the truth may lack only 2 votes, and you will see, justice can be so close, but still so out of reach. Civil trial. Only 2 votes missing for justice. When the criminal justice system closed all doors, Priscilla Davis had no other choice. She turned to the civil court. In 1987, Priscilla and Andrea's biological father, Jack Wilborn, filed a lawsuit against Cullen Davis for their daughter's death. Unlike the criminal court, here there was no need for beyond reasonable doubt. Only the preponderance of evidence was required. That is, a probability greater than 50%. In other words, the jury only needed to believe that Cullen Davis was more likely to have killed Andrea than not. The trial dragged on. This time, there was no widespread sexual defamation like before. There were no days of Priscilla being publicly humiliated. And the result was very close. The jury voted 8 believed Cullen was responsible, 4 did not. In many states, that would be enough. But in Texas, the law requires 10 votes to make a civil judgment. Only 2 votes were missing. 2 votes. The judge declared mistrial. Once again, the truth stood right at the door of justice but was not allowed to enter. Finally, Cullen Davis agreed to an out-of-court settlement, about $5 million. It sounded like a victory. But soon after, the oil industry plummeted. Cullen declared bankruptcy. Priscilla received almost nothing. By 1990, the woman who once lived in a $6 million mansion was left with only a 1-bedroom apartment in Oak Lawn, Dallas. No more diamonds, no more evening gowns. She worked standing in the shopping mall at the Neiman Marcus perfume counter, spraying perfume onto small sheets for customers. Meanwhile, her eldest daughter, Dee, spent 9 years in and out of prison for heroin, giving birth to a baby girl while incarcerated in Gatesville. Priscilla adopted her granddaughter. And she said something I can never forget. I think God gave me this baby because he took Andrea away. Everything gradually becomes clear. I will take you to the ending. An ending with no victory, no one punished, only sickness, death, man who never paid the price for anything. If you think this story is heartbreaking enough, prepare yourself because the final part is much colder. The silent death, the lived in peace. Priscilla Davis's final years were free from the spotlight. No more press, no more lawyers, no more courts. Only one woman who survived a gunshot, but never survived the truth. In August 1999, Priscilla discovered a tumor in her breast. The same breast that had been pierced by a bullet 23 years earlier. The doctor diagnosed stage 4 cancer, metastasized to her spine, legs, and liver. No more miracles, no more hope of recovery. In her final months, Priscilla repeated one sentence to anyone who would listen: I will go to my grave with this truth. Cullen Davis killed my child. The 19th of February, 2001, Priscilla Davis died at 59 years old. No money, no justice, no conviction for the man she accused. Meanwhile, what about Cullen Davis? He entered old age without ever spending a day in prison. He became a reborn in faith, preaching with televised pastors, marrying Karen Master shortly after his acquittal. To this day, he still lives in the Fort Worth area, still maintaining his innocence. And somewhere in a cold basement of American memory, a 2-year-old girl died nearly half a century ago without ever being named in a verdict. This story is not just about money, not just about domestic violence, not just about a murder case. It speaks of a system where justice is not measured by truth, but by the thickness of the wallet. And I want to ask you, before I finish, if 3 witnesses are not enough, if a child dying in the basement is not enough, if a woman shot in the chest is still considered untrustworthy, then in that world, who is truly protected by the law? If you have your own thoughts, please leave them in the comments. And if you want me to continue analyzing cases where wealth has distorted justice, please let me know. Because there are stories, if not told, they will be buried, like Andrea Wilborn. When kindness becomes a map to your death, there is a mathematics to generosity that most people never stop to calculate. Every time you help a stranger, every ride you offer, every smile you give without asking questions, you are not just being kind. You are giving away data, your routines, your habits, the hour you come home, the way you unlock your door, the fact that you live alone. Information accumulates quietly in other people's minds until one day someone decides they know enough. This story is about a young woman who believed kindness was harmless, who believed money meant protection, who believed living in a beautiful building in a glamorous city surrounded by people meant she was safe. She was wrong. In 1944, Los Angeles was swollen with uniforms. Soldiers on leave, men passing through for days, sometimes only hours, before being shipped overseas. The city pulsed with music, dance halls, wartime romance, and the illusion that danger belongs somewhere else. On distant battlefields, not behind apartment doors. And in the middle of it all was a 20-year-old oil heiress named Georgette Bauerdorf. She spent her evenings dancing with soldiers at the Hollywood canteen, giving rides to hitchhiking servicemen, buying small luxuries for boys who might be dead within weeks. She became known for it. Warm, approachable, generous, beloved. And that reputation, the very thing that made her admired, also taught someone exactly when she came home, how she entered her building, and that she lived alone in an apartment where neighbors had learned not to interfere. In what sounded like private business, on the morning of October 12th, 1944, a maid entered Georgette's West Hollywood apartment. She found the bathroom door open. The water was still running. Steam filled the room. And there, face down in the bathtub, was the body of a 20-year-old heiress. Scalding water pouring over her skin, a wad of gauze forced down her throat, bruises covering her body from a violent struggle that had echoed through thin walls while neighbors chose not to act. The fingerprints lifted from the scene were never matched to anyone. The servicemen who had seen her that night were cleared, and the killer disappeared, absorbed into the massive wartime population, where a man could murder, transfer bases, and vanish before detectives ever learned his name. An oil fortune bought Georgette Bauerdorf a glamorous address. It bought her independence. It bought her freedom rare for women of her era, but it could not buy her safety from whoever waited in the dark, invited in, unknowingly, by kindness. Before we understand how she died, we need to understand how she lived and how money built the illusion that nothing bad could ever touch her. Born into oil, raised inside an illusion of safety, Georgette Bauerdorf entered the world in 1924, cushioned by oil. Not Hollywood money, not celebrity money, but the older, quieter kind of wealth extracted from Oklahoma oil fields, money that came from land, drilling rights, pipelines, and boardrooms rather than cameras and applause. Her father, George Bauerdorf, was a petroleum executive involved in producing, refining, and distributing oil at a time when energy meant power. This placed the Bauerdorf family among America's industrial elite, the kind of families who didn't need to explain their money because it spoke for itself. They maintained impressive residences on both coasts. A New York home appropriate for their financial standing, and West Coast addresses convenient for business, travel, and discretion. Georgette's childhood unfolded smoothly between staffed houses, private automobiles, and an insulation so complete she would never need to work unless she chose to. This is important to understand because money didn't just protect her materially, it shaped how danger felt distant. When you grow up with drivers, maids, and adults handling problems before they reach you, the world teaches you a quiet lesson. Bad things happen to other people. Her education reinforced that belief. At the Westlake School for Girls, she was surrounded by daughters of the professional and financial elite, an institution known not just for academics, but for social polish, a place where connections mattered as much as grades, and where alumni included Shirley Temple and other figures orbiting Los Angeles's entertainment world. Westlake prepared young women to move confidently through elite spaces, to speak well, to trust the environments they were placed in, to assume that if a space looked refined, it was safe. But friends later described Georgette as someone who resisted the stereotype of the cold debutante. She was approachable, warm, slightly idealistic, the kind of young woman who talked to everyone in the room, not just those with acceptable pedigrees, who didn't measure people by their last names or bank accounts, who wanted to contribute something beyond her family's money. That impulse to step outside the bubble without shedding the assumptions that came with it would quietly shape everything that followed. Instead of living a life entirely arranged for her, Georgette chose movement. She took a part-time position at the Los Angeles Times, an unusual choice for an heiress. It wasn't about the paycheck. It was about seeing how the city worked. Newsrooms exposed her to real lives, real stories, and the machinery behind image making in a city obsessed with appearances. But even that job was secondary to what became central to her identity during the war. The Hollywood canteen. Night after night, she volunteered, serving food, dancing with servicemen, listening to boys who were barely old enough to vote, talk about deployment, fear, and the possibility that they wouldn't come back. She used her own money to buy small luxuries for them, cigarettes, snacks, little comforts. To her, it felt like decency. To the soldiers, she was unforgettable. And to someone watching, she was predictable. By 1944, her parents had relocated to New York. Georgette stayed behind. They left her with a generous allowance, a car, and freedom, the kind of independence that money makes possible long before society thinks a woman should have it. She insisted on remaining in Los Angeles. She wanted acting lessons, screen tests, the social world revolving around studio lots, canteen dances, and the nightlife of the Sunset Strip. Her father's money made all of it possible, without asking permission, without accountability, and without anyone forcing her to think seriously about risk. And it was that independence, beautiful, rare, and intoxicating, that led her to choose the home, where her illusion of safety would finally collapse. The apartment that promised luxury, not protection. When Georgette chose where to live, she didn't choose recklessly. She chose beautifully. A 2-story, fully furnished duplex at El Palacio in West Hollywood, paid for with family money, but unmistakably her own. This wasn't a boarding house. It wasn't supervised. It wasn't a family compound. It was independence, with arches, Built in 1931 by developer William R. Hopman, El Palacio was designed to seduce Spanish Moorish architecture. Tiled stairways, wrought iron balconies, ornate arches framing shadowed courtyards, the kind of place that looked like security because it looked expensive. It sat just a short walk from the Sunset Strip, close enough to nightlife, close enough to opportunity, close enough to feel alive, and it attracted exactly the tenants you'd expect. Actors between contracts, junior writers, aspiring actresses, well-paid professionals, people who kept irregular hours, people who entertained late, people who valued discretion. What management offered was not protection, but silence. No armed guards, no formal doormen, no controlled access, just stairwells, courtyards, unlocked doors, and the unspoken understanding that what happened behind closed doors was nobody else's business. That atmosphere created a dangerous illusion because El Palacio didn't feel exposed. It felt private, and privacy is where predators thrive. At night, the building changed. The decorative arches became blind corners. The tiled staircases amplified footsteps, then swallowed them. The courtyards turned into pockets of darkness where someone could stand and wait without being seen. To Georgette, it felt glamorous. To someone studying it, it felt perfect. She drove her own car, came and went alone, kept late hours. Neighbors noticed, but didn't question. That mattered because someone understood something crucial. This building trained people not to interfere. And on the night she was killed, that understanding became lethal. On October 11th, 1944, her evening began exactly as it always did. A shift at the Hollywood canteen, serving food, dancing with servicemen, smiling at boys who might be shipped overseas within days. She left shortly after 11:15 p.m. But she didn't go home. She told acquaintances she wasn't ready to end the night yet. She wanted to keep dancing. That decision extended her evening and extended her exposure. Her next stop was the Hollywood Palladium, one of the city's premier dance venues, a massive ballroom where wartime big bands played, for crowds of civilians and military personnel, a place where rank, class, and background dissolved into music. She danced until around 2 a.m., not with one man, with several. The same generosity she practiced at the canteen followed her off the clock. After leaving the Palladium, she encountered a hitchhiking army sergeant. She offered him a ride. During the drive, she mentioned she was in a hurry. She was expecting a late-night long-distance call from her boyfriend, an army officer stationed in Texas. She didn't want to miss him if he managed to call. The soldier, later identified as Gordon Ovid, said she dropped him near Sunset Boulevard. Then she turned toward West Hollywood, alone. He would be the last confirmed person to see her alive. What waited for her at El Palacio had not been improvised. It had been prepared. The automatic hallway light outside her apartment, the bulb that normally illuminated the corridor, when someone approached, had been deliberately unscrewed. The landing was dark, a blind ambush zone. When investigators later examined that bulb, they found fingerprints. They matched no one in Georgette's household, and no one they ever identified. Evidence that, in another era, might have solved everything. Reduced in 1944 to a silent question mark. Somewhere in the dark early morning hours, she returned home, and the violence began. It was loud enough that neighbors later remembered it. A woman's voice crying out, "Stop, stop, you're killing me." Words that echoed through thin walls, words that were dramatic, but not dramatic enough. Because in a building like El Palacio, people had learned not to intervene. Arguments were private. Lovers fought. Noise didn't mean danger. No one reached for a phone. By the time the screaming stopped, the illusion of safety had already done its work. The screams that were heard and ignored. When Georgette reached her building in the early hours of October 12th, nothing appeared out of place. No broken locks, No forced entry visible from the outside. No sign that the night waiting for her would end differently than the dozens before it. But the hallway outside her apartment was dark. The automatic light that usually flicked on when someone approached, the small, mundane detail meant to offer reassurance, had been deliberately disabled. The bulb unscrewed, a choice. Someone had stood there in advance, long enough to prepare, long enough to understand exactly where she would pause to unlock her door. What happened next did not unfold quietly. Investigators later determined the attack began almost immediately. After she entered her apartment, furniture was knocked over. Objects were displaced. Rooms showed signs of chaos, inconsistent with a surprise assault that ended quickly. This was not a silent crime. This was a fight. Georgette did not submit. She resisted violently, desperately. Bruises would later be found on her arms, legs, and torso. A map of struggle written across her body. At some point, the violence moved upstairs, into the bathroom, and that is when the neighbors heard her. A woman's voice, clear enough to remember decades later. Stop. Stop. You're killing me. Those words traveled through thin apartment walls and down tiled corridors. They were not whispers. They were not muffled. They were pleas. But in a building designed around discretion, no one intervened. No one knocked. No one called the police. No one broke the spell of privacy that El Palacio quietly enforced. People later explained it the same way. They assumed it was a lover's quarrel, a domestic argument, none of their business. That assumption mattered more than they ever knew, because this was not a private dispute. It was a woman being murdered. By the time the sounds stopped, whatever chance existed for interruption, for survival, was gone. Morning light revealed how carefully the crime had been staged to look like something else. A maid noticed Georgette's front door standing slightly ajar. That alone was strange. She was known for being meticulous. Inside, the sound of running water continued. Upstairs, endlessly. When the maid opened the bathroom door, she stepped into steam. Georgette lay face down in a half-filled bathtub. Scalding water poured over her body. She wore only the top half of her pajamas. The bottoms were missing. At first glance, it could have been mistaken for an accident, a fall, a slip, a tragic mistake. But that illusion collapsed almost immediately. The autopsy revealed the truth. There were no signs of drowning. Instead, the medical examiner found a wad of gauze, bandage-like material, forced deep into her throat. It blocked her airway. She died from asphyxiation. While she struggled, while someone held her down, the gauze itself raised new questions. It resembled material commonly found in military medical kits, not something most civilians kept in their homes. A small detail, but a chilling one. Her body told the rest of the story. A prolonged struggle, defensive wounds, clothing torn. Some sources reported evidence suggesting sexual assault, while others stopped short of definitive conclusions. What was clear was this: the killer had not planned on her, fighting back this fiercely. Downstairs, the apartment echoed that chaos. Furniture skewed, items overturned. But this was not a burglary. Cash remained, jewelry remained, valuables untouched. Whatever the original intent had been, theft was not the motive. In the parking area, investigators found gasoline siphoned from Georgette's car. Another small detail, one that fit uncomfortably with stories of her generosity, of helping soldiers short on fuel or money. Someone had known her habits. Someone had prepared, and yet the scene told a contradictory story. The approach was deliberate, the ambush calculated, but the violence was uncontrolled. A plan that unraveled the moment Georgette refused to submit quietly. And that chaos, full of evidence, noise, and witnesses who chose silence, would still not be enough to name a killer. A perfect crime for a wartime city. In the hours after Georgette Bauerdorf was found dead, investigators moved quickly. They had to. Because in 1944 Los Angeles, time was not neutral. It was the enemy. The city was flooded with transient men, soldiers on leave, war plant workers, sailors passing through, men whose names appeared briefly on rosters before disappearing again. If the killer was one of them, he was already slipping away. Detectives from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department began where the danger was most obvious: Georgette's social life. They compiled lists of servicemen she had danced with at the Hollywood canteen, men she'd spoken to, men who had driven her home, men who might have mistaken kindness for intimacy. Every soldier who could be traced from her final night was located and questioned. The hitchhiking army sergeant she had given a ride to, the last confirmed person to see her alive, was tracked down. His timeline checked out. No physical evidence connected him to the crime scene. He was cleared. The men who danced with her at the canteen were cleared. So were those she'd encountered at the Palladium. Investigators pushed harder. They asked uncomfortable questions. Had she rejected anyone recently? Had a soldier become obsessive? Had politeness been misread as promise? Some accounts suggested Georgette had mentioned a man who lingered too long, a serviceman who showed up repeatedly, who interpreted her warmth as something personal, the kind of one-sided fixation that can turn dangerous when fantasy collapses. But suspicion was not evidence. And evidence in 1944 had sharp limits. Fingerprints were lifted from the disabled hallway light bulb from inside the apartment. But fingerprints meant nothing without a known suspect to compare them to. There was no national database, no instant matching, no way to check prints against millions of servicemen passing through California. Fibers were collected, but fiber analysis required a person, not a theory, and DNA. The one thing that might have rewritten this entire story did not exist as a forensic tool. The war itself worked against the case with brutal efficiency. If the killer was a soldier, he could be transferred to another base, shipped overseas, killed in combat, or simply reassigned. Before investigators ever learned his name, paper records were thin. Coordination between military and civilian authorities was limited, and as weeks turned into months, momentum faded. Physical evidence deteriorated. Some exhibits were discarded according to mid-century police practices that never imagined a future where cold cases could be reopened with new technology. What had once been a solvable puzzle became a historical ghost. By 1947, another murder would eclipse Georgette's in the public imagination. The Black Dahlia, more grotesque, more theatrical, better copy for newspapers and books. The oil heiress found dead in her bathtub became a footnote, occasionally mentioned, rarely remembered. Some true crime writers later speculated about connections between the two cases. Young women, Hollywood-adjacent lives, sexualized violence, possible staging. But speculation is not proof, and no evidentiary bridge has ever elevated those theories. Beyond conjecture, the reality is simpler and colder. Georgette Bauerdorf's killer was never identified, never charged, never named. He vanished into a wartime city, built perfectly for disappearance, erased by time, marked by silence. History does not remember every victim equally. Some deaths become legends. Others dissolve into archives, file numbers, yellowed photographs, a few lines in old newspapers. Georgette Bauerdorf belonged to the second category. In the years after her murder, the world moved on quickly. The war ended. Soldiers came home. Hollywood reinvented itself. And 3 years later, another killing would seize the public imagination with far greater force. One more brutal, more theatrical, easier to sensationalize. Compared to that spectacle, Georgette's story seemed quiet. An heiress, a bathtub, no arrest. There were no trials, no villains in handcuffs, no courtroom drama to keep her name alive. So she faded. mentioned occasionally in retrospectives, footnotes, a tragic aside in books about wartime Los Angeles. The narrative that survived was shallow, a careless party girl, too trusting, too naive. That version was easier than confronting the truth because the truth was uncomfortable. Georgette was not reckless. She was doing exactly what society encouraged women like her to do during the war: volunteer, uplift morale, treat soldiers kindly, open doors, smile, dance, listen. Her mistake was believing that kindness did not create risk, that wealth meant insulation, that living in a beautiful building meant protection. El Palacio still stands today. Its Spanish Moorish arches are photographed for their charm, its courtyards praised in architectural write-ups. Real estate listings emphasize history and elegance, but history is selective. What those descriptions rarely mention is that within those walls, a young woman screamed for help, and no one answered. To those who know the story, El Palacio is not just picturesque. It is a reminder that environments can train people into silence. That privacy can become complicity. That money can buy beauty, but not vigilance. Georgette's legacy is not a solved mystery. It is a question. How many times do we mistake comfort for safety? How often do we assume danger announces itself loudly, obviously, from the outside? Her life reframed her death. She was not a cautionary tale about recklessness. She was a lesson about assumptions, about how independence without protection becomes exposure, about how kindness, when unguarded, can teach the wrong person everything they need to know. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all, Georgette Bauerdorf did not die because she was careless. She died because she believed the world was safer than it was, the last thing money could not buy. There was no dramatic ending to Georgette Bauerdorf's story. No courtroom, no verdict, no moment where justice arrived late but intact. Her killer was never named. And perhaps that is why her story unsettles in a way others do not, because nothing interrupts it. It simply stops. A young woman born into oil wealth, raised inside comfort, given freedom that most women of her era never touched. She lived alone by choice, worked by choice, helped by instinct, and she died in a place that looked secure, surrounded by people who heard her voice and did nothing. Her father's money bought architecture. It bought location. It bought independence. What it could not buy was a neighbor who intervened, a locked corridor, a light bulb that stayed screwed in. In the end, Georgette did not fall victim to poverty or desperation or crime-ridden streets. She fell victim to assumptions. The assumption that strangers are safe. The assumption that beauty equals protection. The assumption that kindness carries no cost. Wartime Los Angeles was a city designed for disappearance. Men passed through without roots. Names were temporary, faces blurred together. And somewhere inside that chaos, one man learned enough about a generous young woman to know exactly how to reach her. When she was alone, that is what makes this story endure. Not the mystery of who killed her, but the clarity of how easily it happened. Because Georgette Bauerdorf did everything right according to the rules she was taught. And those rules failed her completely. So I want to ask you, had you ever heard of Georgette Bauerdorf before today? And more importantly, do you think her death was inevitable? In a world where kindness is mistaken for safety? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about wealth, illusion, and the price women quietly pay for independence, make sure you subscribe, because this is not an isolated tragedy. It is a pattern, and we're only just beginning to uncover it. She was the face of freedom, beauty, and rebellion. But no one talks about how lonely she really was. Before we mention silk dresses, dreamy eyes, or iconic photographs of the 60 seconds, I want you to pause for a moment because the woman in this story is not just a muse, not just a fashion icon, not just the prettiest woman in the room. She is the embodiment of an era when freedom was revered, when rebellion was seen as alluring, and when loneliness was cleverly concealed under a carefree exterior. Imagine living in the center of everything: music, fashion, art, names that would later become legends. You walk into a room and all eyes are on you. But when night falls, when the music fades, when no one is watching anymore, you are left alone, alone. This woman was Mick Jagger's best friend. She was a bohemian icon of the 1,960 seconds. She entered the Getty family, one of the world's richest and most powerful empires. But very few people ask a simple question: what is the price of being the muse of a generation? And why did a woman considered the embodiment of freedom die in a Rome hotel room at age Tridive? From drugs, in such haunting solitude? Her name was Talitha Getty, and the story you are about to hear is not a beautiful story. But the surprise is at the end of the video. It's a story about fame that's too close, about freedom without a foundation, and about a woman admired by the whole world, but never understood. Paradox. There's a strange paradox in the 1,960 seconds. It was the age of freedom, of breaking the rules, of living instinctively and rejecting all old patterns. People called it the era of liberation. But in that very era, many people died from loneliness. The woman in this story is the perfect embodiment of that paradox. She wasn't a singer, not an actress. She didn't need to stand on stage. Just by appearing, she became an icon. Her beauty didn't come from perfection. It came from a sense of freedom, from her dreamy eyes, from a demeanor as if she belonged to no one. The whole world looked at her and thought, this is a woman who lived true to herself. But very few people ask themselves, if you are the muse of an entire generation who sees your true self, when the lights are out, she lived among the greatest artists of the era. Music, fashion, parties that lasted until dawn. She was close friends with Mick Jagger. She was the bohemian face copied across magazines. She was the one who entered one of the most powerful families in the world. From the outside, this was the life everyone wanted. But the question is, can you be a symbol of freedom without having a place to belong? Can you live among hundreds of people without anyone truly staying? That woman's name was Talitha Getty. And from the moment we mention this name, you see an unavoidable paradox. A woman who represented freedom ended her life in a hotel room. A muse of an era passed away at age 30 from drugs in silence. In the next part, we will go back to the beginning. Not the glamour, not the fashion, but the most important question: how did Talitha Getty become a muse? And when did the price of that role begin to be paid? The origins of freedom. Before becoming a symbol of freedom, Talitha grew up with a very familiar feeling, a feeling of not belonging anywhere. She was born in an unstable place. Her childhood was constantly on the move. Relationships came and went. There was no real home, no fixed order to cling to. And when you grow up like that, you learn one thing very early on: don't stay too long. Don't put your faith in stability, because everything can disappear. Talitha didn't seek security. She sought movement, music, fashion, people who lived outside the norm, not because of rebellion, but because there, no one demanded that she be anyone else. In the 1,960 seconds, the world was changing faster than ever before. Old rules were crumbling. New values hadn't yet formed. And Talitha stepped into that void, as if she were born to be there. She wasn't trying to be an icon. She was just living. But that's what made the world start seeing her as a role model. Talitha's photographs are not because she poses, but because she is present. A dreamy gaze, a relaxed demeanor, freedom emanating from the way she stands, the way she walks into a room. But freedom also has a dark side. When you don't belong anywhere, you have nowhere to go. And deep down, Talitha knew that. She was always in the crowd, but rarely in a deep enough relationship. She was used to being admired, but not used to being held back. Therefore, when a very large door opened, the door of power, money, and a huge family, Talitha stepped in, not out of ambition, but out of hope. Hope that this time, her freedom would have a foothold. In the next section, we will talk about that marriage. The marriage that brought Talitha into the Getty Empire and began a new paradox. When a woman living for freedom must learn to survive in a world of power and control. A marriage with the Getty Empire. When Talitha entered the Getty family, many thought that she had finally landed. From the bohemian artist parties, Talitha entered a completely different world. Not the dreamy lights, not the spontaneous freedom, but money, power, and unwritten rules, but no one dared break them. The Getty Empire was unlike other wealthy families. It was a system. Everything was orderly. Everyone had a role, and every move was watched. To the outside world, Talitha was a lucky woman, the bohemian muse, married to a man from the most powerful family on the planet. A modern-day fairy tale, but inside, Talitha began to feel something very familiar, a sense of alienation. She wasn't asked to change completely, but she wasn't allowed to be herself either. Talitha's freedom became something, an awkwardness, too free to fit in, too different to be fully accepted. And in those vast rooms, among boundless wealth, Talitha began to withdraw, not out of fear, but out of weariness. When you live your whole life as a symbol, at some point, you just want to be a normal person. But Talitha didn't have that. She was seen everywhere, but rarely heard. The parties continued. The trips continued lavishly. But the connections were growing thinner and thinner. And when freedom has no place, when difference becomes a burden, Talitha begins to look for an escape. Not by leaving, but by numbing her emotions. In the next part, we will enter the most dangerous phase. When drugs are no longer a symbol of rebellion, but become a refuge. When a muse begins to disappear, even while still in everyone's sight. When freedom becomes a retreat. In the 1,960 seconds, drugs weren't seen as a tragedy. They were given beautiful names, expanding consciousness, liberating oneself, breaking free from old limitations, and Talitha lived right in the heart of that language. Initially, it wasn't a fall from grace. It was a way to blend into the world around her, a way to avoid feeling lost, a way to keep pace with people who lived in extreme states. But there was a very fine line between seeking inspiration and escaping emotions. Talitha started using drugs, not to create, but to avoid feeling, not to feel loneliness, not to feel the conflict between her true self and the role she was forced to play. When you're the muse of a generation, you're not allowed to fall apart. You have to always be beautiful, always free, always carefree. And Talitha did that very well, too well. She appeared in iconic photographs, still dreamy, still captivating, still the role model others wanted to emulate. But inside, she was drifting away from herself little by little. Drugs became her refuge. No fuss, no drama, just a way to slow down the pain that no one saw. And the scariest thing is, no one stopped her. Because when you're seen as a symbol of freedom, every action is rationalized. They call it a lifestyle. They call it art. They call it the price of genius. No one calls it a cry for help. Talitha was still in the midst of the crowds, still invited to parties, still spoken of as a living legend. But with each passing day, she retreated deeper and deeper into herself. And then there was a journey, not a journey to find inspiration, not a journey to rest, but the final journey. And now we will talk about Rome, a hotel, a closed room, and the moment when both Talitha's image and her being were separated forever. The last night in Rome, Rome wasn't a place Talitha went to escape to. At least, nobody thought so. The city was once a symbol of art, of history, of classical beauty, a familiar stop. For those who lived by inspiration, Talitha stayed in a hotel, a not-so-large room, no stage, no lights, just a closed space where no one had to play a role anymore. That night, there was no loud tragedy, no screaming, no police raid, only a body found the next morning. Talitha Getty died at the age of 30. The cause of death was recorded very concisely. Overdose. A short word. A quick conclusion. And almost immediately, the world began to simplify the story. People said, she lived too extremely. She chose that lifestyle. That's the price of freedom. But very few asked, why did such an admired woman have to die alone in a hotel room? No family was there. No close friends. No one to hold her hand. Talitha's death didn't cause a major shock. Not because she wasn't important, but because she had been transformed into an image for too long, a muse, a symbol, a lifestyle, not a human being, whose capacity for endurance was dwindling. After Talitha's death, the photos continued to be reprinted. The outfits continued to be copied. The bohemian style continued to be celebrated. But the real person was gone. And the saddest thing is, when Talitha passed away, the world didn't lose an icon. The world only lost a woman they never truly understood. Next, we'll talk about what happened afterward. How Talitha Getty was framed as a legend, and how the truth behind the glamour was left behind forever. After death, a legend is created. After Talitha's death, everything happened very quickly. Not mourning, but image recycling. Old photographs were brought out. Outfits were named. Beautiful phrases appeared frequently. Muse, symbol of freedom, embodiment of the 60 seconds. The story became concise, easy to tell, easy to consume. A woman who lived freely died for her own lifestyle. It sounds logical, but it's also very convenient, because when you turn a person into a legend, you are no longer responsible for their pain. No one talks about loneliness. No one talks about feeling lost in a powerful family. No one talks about a woman being required to be free all the time, but not allowed to be weak. Talitha is remembered through her image, not through her emotions, and that is the ultimate paradox. A woman seen by the whole world, but never truly understood. It's time for the climax, when we will talk about something even deeper, the true price of being a muse, and why so many women after Talitha have fallen into the same trap. The price of becoming a muse. Society loves muses because muses don't need to speak. They don't need to argue. They don't need to demand. A muse just needs to be beautiful and present. Talitha was loved when she was silent, when she was dreamy, when she didn't upset anyone. But the moment a muse needed to be listened to, the world began to turn away, because images are easy to love. People are not. Talitha was not the first and will not be the last to be swallowed up by that role. When you are loved for your image, you gradually lose the right to be yourself. And if you don't have a safe place to return to, no relationship real enough to hold you, freedom turns into an emptiness, a void that is often filled with things that numb emotions. In the final part, when we all watch the ending together, we will close this story, not with judgment, but with a question for ourselves. A legacy left behind. Talitha Getty left no estate, no manifesto, no explanation. What she left behind was a beautiful image and a story never fully told. A story of freedom without a foundation, of glory without protection. Talitha is remembered as an icon of the 1,960 seconds. But if we listen more closely, this story doesn't belong only to the past. It's for anyone who has ever been loved for their image, but never for who they truly are. Because ultimately, freedom isn't about doing everything. Freedom is knowing that When you are vulnerable, there is still a place to return to.